path forward than putting properties in front of the wrecking ball. So we set out with a clear strategy to achieve revitalization of Millers through historic preservation. And the town wrangled for over 5 years, litigating a tax title taking of a linchpin property right in the heart of the village center. We call these the Powers Block properties. And these are 3 adjacent mixed-use buildings, once the center of activity in the main intersection, but they had fallen into blight and disrepair. You can go to the next slide. This is the kind of the main building in the Powers Block, right there on the main intersection. The town issued an RFP, a request for proposals for developers to take over the property. The first one yielded no results. Abutters were claiming that this property needed to be torn down. It was blight. Contractors looked at it, said it's not viable. The town went out for another RFP, and thankfully we were able to get a local developer interested in taking on the property. Got it from $1 from the town. This local developer was unproven, kind of new, but had a vision for reusing it. And he hooked up with a historic preservation consultant, Chris Sawyer-Lozano, who happens to live in town, and it's kind of a passion project for him. And they were able to deliver the rehab of this building and 2 others through historic tax credits. And to facilitate getting the tax credits, the town worked with the FERCOG to prepare and file a historic registered district nomination for the village center of Millers Falls. So the Powers Block here on the left, you're seeing 2016 before renovation. After beginning the initial work, Aubert Construction discovered that the building was on the verge of collapse. It was worse than we had thought. They had to build a new foundation on the east side and reattach the building to the new foundation. And on the right, you're looking at the building after about $1 million was put into the renovation. It had structural issues, had a leaky roof, compromised sections of the interior, but now the upper floors are all renovated. There's 7 market rate apartments in the upper floors, and the first floor retail space was fully renovated into a new storefront. Go to the next page, Beth. This building is immediately next to that large brick building, and this was another mixed use building. And let's see, the 31 East Main Street, it was condemned by the town. It was unsafe, and it was going to have imminent collapse. The building had to be raised up, and a new foundation was poured below it, and then it was placed back down. And on the right, you're looking at the building as it's rehabbed. It's a busy laundromat. There was a strong need for a laundromat in the village, and the developer was able to meet that need, and he put an apartment in the upper floor. We can go to the next slide. And you're looking at the third building as part of the whole Powers Block. So this is the whole Powers Block property. That was the first step in revitalization, right there in the village center. Had a huge impact. These were 3 blighted buildings that went from blight to active reuse. Altogether, there's 9 apartments across these buildings, and 3 storefronts have been activated. That was the initial redevelopment project, and we know that the success follows success, and so Aubert was able to take on a building that's actually next to these properties. It was the historic Millers Falls Inn. We can go to the next slide, Beth. So the Millers Falls Inn is a landmark property. It's where Theodore Roosevelt had once done a stump on his whistle stop tour, because there's railroad tracks right behind there. And this building was condemned by the town. It was condemned in 2018. And they were able to do historic rehab work on it. All new wiring and plumbing, all new sheetrock. They reopened all the closed windows. So on the upper left, you're looking at a historical picture of it in its full glory. On the lower picture, that's it recently. They closed off all the windows. The porch was long gone, and it was kind of just an ugly building. And it was owned by a slumlord for many years, and it was a very problematic property. And with the historic rehab, they're rebuilding the porch and they reclaimed the windows, and made it more of a functioning part of the downtown. This was a fairly large project. There's 11 units inside this apartment, and it's just reopening to the public now. Beth, we can go to the next slide. And here's a picture of the 4 buildings that were rehabbed all next to each other in the village center. And we can go to the next slide. Okay, I think that's it. So altogether, we're talking about $850,000 in state historic tax credits and $850,000 in federal historic tax credits were brought to this project. I'm not an expert in how tax credits work, but we know that they were critical to making these projects work. For each of these 4 buildings were, essentially on the chopping block, slated for demolition, but the finances that the tax credits brought helped make them viable. So it was a little bit of hitting lucky with getting a developer who was able to take on the risk and have the vision in a relatively weak market, and having the right incentives and programs being brought to the table. And it's had a huge impact. The town just did a village center plan for Millers Falls, and the community, it really expressed the community's optimism for the way things are going. And it all starts with saving the buildings and looking at your history as a jumping off point for community development. That's all I've got. Beth, you're on mute.
Thank you for reminding me. Thank you, Walter. And again, if you have any questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat, and we'll talk about them at the end. Our next speaker is Brian Lever, who is going to talk about Greenfield, Sears, and Roebuck store. I saw Brian on my list of participants.
I unmuted myself.
Oh, great. Thank you, Brian. And just cue me when you want me to flip to the next slide.
Sure. Actually, if you could go to the next slide down. So the title is Looking Deeper at Historic Photographs, and this is the one historic image that we were able to come up with for the Sears and Roebuck and Company store that was built on 102 Main Street at Greenfield. And the picture's from roughly 1940. We know that because there was an addition that was built to the right, basically where all that wood framing is. Can you go to the next slide? So this building has had an interesting history. It was a store owned and operated by Sears for many years, all the way up until the 1990s. It has the main block, which is sort of the tan beige brick in the center. On the right-hand side, there's a red brick addition that was added in 1947, and we'll see in a later slide that they also added a service bay to repair and service automobiles around 1960. Over the course of Sears ownership and subsequent owners, they made a number of alterations to the building. What were, historic storefronts were removed at the first story, along with the doors. There is some red brick infill above those first floor storefronts. There's a different type of red brick infill up at the second story with new windows that have been added. And by the time our client, who is the Center for Human Development, came along, the building was really only about half occupied. A number of changes had also occurred in the interior. And what the Center for Human Development, which is a nonprofit, was looking to do was create a community health center. They work with a number of different social services and medical and outpatient services, and they were looking to kind of combine disparate entities at different locations right here in downtown Greenfield, and they had chosen this building. You'll see later on some of the plans that show all the different treatment rooms and offices that end up being constructed. Can you go to the next slide, please? This is the service bay addition that was built right around 1960. this portion of the building is a little bit more intact than the main block. You can see one of the garage bay doors was infilled, but aside from that, it's actually, at least from the exterior, is largely in original condition. Can you go to the next slide? On the interior, a lot has happened over time. They've taken out pretty much all the original partitions. At one point, they even cut the staircase in half, so it doesn't even go up to the second floor, and walled it in. And a later tenant came in and made offices at various different parts of the building as well. So some sections were vacant, some sections were offices. It was all these different types of interior conditions. Can you go to the next slide? There was one hidden treasure that we found above the acoustic tile ceiling. We noticed that there was some tin ceiling that was still remaining in this large hallway that you can see at the photo at the top left. And the bottom picture is the inside of that service bay addition at the back. Next slide, please. So the goals of the project were really to create this community outpatient health center. They're going to utilize historic tax credits to help finance the project and preserve and rehabilitate the building while facilitating the new use. The architect, Bob Halvas from Architectural Insights, had reached out to the Greenfield Historical Commission, who provided us with this historic photograph of the building, which really served as the basis of everything that we ended up doing as far as the rehab scope. Next slide, please. So in general, when we look at these photographs, most of the time we have them from the exterior. Occasionally we find historic photographs on the interior of the building as well. So when we think about how we're going to redesign and restore a building, this kind of serves as our baseline. And there are a number of easy things that we could do. We could, and did, restore the windows, and we aligned the window mullions. It's kind of hard to see, but up at the top, you can see these little indentations of lines. Those are recessed brick headers, and they align with the window mullions. So when we designed a new window system, we were able to restore that so that it all aligns vertically in the building. We were able to come up with a sympathetically designed historic siding band, and we can preserve the historic tile, the brick, and the cast stone. And those are all sort of basic and fairly easy things that we could accomplish having had this photograph. Can you go to the next slide, please? The challenges, though, that we found were that, one, we only had this one image. We didn't know what the building looked like on the interior historically. But more so, the biggest challenge with the project that we had is that it's going to be a medical office and outpatient treatment facility. So this requires privacy. So a view, an open view through the building was simply not going to be possible. And we couldn't cover over the windows. We couldn't darken the windows because that would conflict with historically how it would have appeared and typical treatment procedures. So we had to come up with a way of figuring out how to create privacy on the interior while still creating sort of an open and transparent feel to the storefront. Can you go to the next slide, please? So we went back to the historic photograph again, and we started looking at it, both myself and the architect, and we spent a little bit of time talking about it, and also how the building was used. And we know it was used as a store, and we started to kind of look, bay by bay across the building. And you can see a number of different things. One is that, there's signage. Either it's on the glass, it's kind of hard to tell, or it's on an awning, or it might be behind the glass. And you can also see that there are some display areas where you can see items, certainly at the sort of the bottom right of the photograph, there's a nice storefront display area of things that were for sale. But if you look behind that, you can see you actually can't see into the interior of the building. That storefront display creates basically an interior partition wall. And most likely it was something that you probably opened up from the back and you took things that were sale or for display for sale, and you pulled them in and out of the storefront. So some of the signage and then the storefront ends up blocking view of the interior. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what we decided to do, our solution for this, is that we would create essentially a faux storefront that sort of emulated, the depth and feel that you would see in the historic photographs. And that would create a privacy sort of screen on the first story. At the second story, we used some of the offices that could be open for view, and we put those up on the second story, and we had them designed in such a way so that the partition walls either aligned with the brick piers or had these very thin partitions to align with the window mullions, so you couldn't actually see them from the exterior. Can you go to the next slide? So at the first story, you can see over at the right, we created a new partition wall that was set back from the front of the building. That's a big sort of white area with the doors in the center. And that's where the new storefront display ends up being. We were able to restore the tin ceiling along this long corridor, which you see up at the top of the screen. And at the bottom left, we were able to replace the garage doors with a storefront style door system that sort of emulates the rectangular pattern of the doors. Can you go to the next slide? You can see that storefront display area here in more detail. And we were able to provide a fairly good amount of depth. And the other thing that we did is we actually painted the interior wall a dark gray. So it actually even kind of creates a larger sense of depth as well. Can you go to the next slide? Up at the second floor, you can see some of our partitions. We ended up creating jogs in their partitions that were set pretty far back. It looks like they're not far back just because of the scale of the image, but they're actually 3 to 4 feet back in most cases. Or very thin partitions where you see there's one that you can, if you can read it, it says butt glaze partition that actually aligns with the window mullion. You can go to the next slide. So in the end, what we came up with was a system that really, you can't see into the interior, but it still has a storefront display. And you can kind of see they've already displayed a little bit. There's a sign over at the bottom right image that says a little bit about the Center for Human Development. And over time, what they're going to do is they're going to create the first floor as a display for artwork and information about the organization. At the second story, there are the window blinds, but those actually retract all the way up into the ceiling. So once they're actually, they're raised, you can't see them at all. We have sign bands, one in the main block, and then there's one in the addition that sort of denotes the entrance that are sympathetic in the design and the text that we used. And we were able to remove all the red brick, align the window mullions up with the headers that are up just below the roof parapet, and preserve the historic brick and especially the tile that you can see along the sidewalk at the first story. Can you go to the next slide, please? And here you can kind of see the two images, both the historic image and the after condition. Next slide, please. The image at the top left is a little bit of that interior storefront display where eventually it'll become artwork. And at the bottom right, you can see we were able to restore the tin ceiling. Next slide, please. And then over at the service bay edition, we have some of the, it's kind of hard because it was a sunny day and we're getting some reflection. We actually have where those garage doors were, these storefronts that have rectangular glazed partitions. So they emulate the garage doors that were there. And that should be the last slide. That's pretty much the project.
Brian, thank you. That was great. Very interesting. And our next speaker is Sarah LaValley, and she is going to talk about the Seth Thomas street clock restoration in Northampton.
All right. Everybody hear me okay?
Loud and clear. And again,
All
Sarah,
right.
hear me, and I will move forward.
All right.
Slide.
So I'm Sarah LaValley. I'm a conservation and preservation planner with the city of Northampton. And I wanted to share a great experience we had with locating and restoring a historic street clock that formerly had been on Main Street in Northampton. All right, next slide. Next slide. All right, so this is a picture of the clock that was installed. So the previous picture was one that was a picture of the clock in about 1915, just after it was dedicated by President Calvin Coolidge. It sat there until the 70s, and then it disappeared. Nobody knows exactly when. So designed by Seth Thomas and dedicated by Northampton Mayor and future President Calvin Coolidge, beautiful street clock sat on the corner of Main Street and Strong Avenue for just over 100 years until it was removed. While an important and attractive part of the streetscape, the clock was always unfortunately privately owned in conjunction with the block in front of which it sat, so that, you know, the beautiful ornamentation on top was removed and some advertising put on top of it, and it changed over the years, sort of fell into disrepair. The clock was dismantled and placed in warehouse storage out of public view in the early 1990s and remained there in steadily deteriorating condition 20 years. And nobody really knew where it was. We looked for it a few times. There'd been some push to locate it and restore it. There was ownership issues, and then it couldn't be found, and then it turned up in a warehouse in Holyoke, actually. So in 2014, the city of Northampton, led by its Office of Planning and Sustainability, approached the owner and arranged for purchase of the clock, provided that it was still in salvageable condition. Next slide. Next one. So this is a picture of the dismantled and defaced clock in the back of a truck after it was removed from storage. The clock was mostly complete, but was missing several key parts. So we engaged clock restoration specialist Peter Nunes to evaluate it. And he noted that while it was in overall good condition, years of storage and location changes meant it was now missing many important parts, including base doors, frosted glass dials and bezels, the drive shaft, as well as the weight to drive the clock's movement. He also noted the clock's impeccable provenance and longtime association with the city of Northampton. And he's restored a lot of clocks over the years, but he was really impressed that this one was there for so long and was, despite its condition, was still pretty original. The Office of Planning and Sustainability worked through 2014 and 2015 to finalize purchase and move the clock, locate missing interior components, original decoration features from another clock to replace an advertising feature that had been mounted to the top, and manage painstaking restoration of the clock to its original appearance when it was originally dedicated. And we accomplished that with using CPA funds. Happily, the Community Preservation Committee was incredibly supportive of the work and was a great partner. The Historical Commission was as well. Next slide. So this is an overview of the parts that were missing: some doors, a driving weight, bezels, dials, the top, and a 2.5-inch threaded pipe that draws all the case parts together. But Peter was able to fabricate these and or locate them from other clocks that weren't in salvageable condition. Next slide. So Peter's restoration steps were to restore and recreate everything that was missing, weld the brakes in the clock case that had been that had happened from it being in storage, and sandblast, prime, and paint the case, replace the missing top ornament, and finally restore brass locks for the new doors. Next slide. So this is Peter at his shop welding the clock back together again. Next slide. New doors were cast using existing side panels for patterns. They weren't able to locate another clock that was exactly like ours, so they did take the side panels and sort of use those to recreate the missing sides. Next slide. So the rest of the interior pieces of the clock as discovered are shown on the left. That is not what they're supposed to look like. They were corroded and very degraded, so they had to be stripped, primed, and painted. And the beautiful end product is on the right. The interior of the clock really looks just as beautiful as the outside. Next slide. And new bezels had to be crafted. This, according to Peter, took a few different tries and was very challenging, but was a new thing for their office to be doing. Next slide. And the weight, the pulleys, the motion works, and the original crank were also restored, before on the left and again after on the right. Next slide. And the advertising piece that had been on top is shown on the left. It was actually two different advertising pieces. You can see the writing underneath, and then the Daniels was placed over that and had a neon over it. And the piece we ended up with on the right from another clock is shown in its restored condition. Next slide. These are the interior lights, and Peter, our restoration expert. Some new wiring sockets and LED bulbs to be energy efficient were installed. Next slide. So the restoration of the clock was really timely with the city's renovation of Pulaski Park downtown. This was an urban park that maybe many of you are familiar with, but it was getting just a little bit tired. It wasn't being used the way it was really designed for and intended to. So the city went through a really thorough and very expensive renovation project, and it's been incredibly successful. So we were able to capitalize on that and install this sort of, not as a centerpiece, but the front entrance piece to Pulaski Park. Next slide. And here is installation day. So this is going in at the front of the park, right next to the Academy of Music, next to the bus station. Next slide. And this is the clock being dedicated by Mayor Narkowitz, just a little bit over 100 years after it was originally dedicated by Mayor Coolidge. And the clock does have to be wound every day, so that's something that the Office of Planning and Sustainability undertakes, and DPW helps us with the maintenance of it. Next slide. And on the left is a plaque that's installed on the exterior and also the interior of the clock, just in case it's ever removed and put in storage again. Thanking Community Preservation Act funds and showing the original installation photo. And the beautiful after photo is on the right. And that's it. Next slide. And I'm happy to chat with anybody about clock restoration or small CPA projects.
Thank you, Sarah. Great. Eileen Mahoney is going to talk next about project in Lenox, Massachusetts, Trinity Church. I saw Eileen.
I'm here.
Oh, great.
I'm all set if you can hear me, yes?
Yep, you're coming through.
Great. Okay, well, hi everybody. I'm Eileen Mahoney. I'm with Trinity Church in Lenox, Massachusetts. And my first challenge with this, putting together these slides, was making sure that preservation was spelled correctly on the slide. So that was success in the beginning, but it was inspiring to hear some of what has already been shared. And I hope what I have to offer can maybe provide some practical insights, etc. But Trinity is a, stay with this slide for a second, if you would. I entitled this Preservation with Imagination because sometimes preservation seems like rather dry, detailed work. And on one level it is, but as we all know, it takes a great deal of imagination. And I should have included flexibility to get the project done. So first slide is, you can switch to the next slide, Beth. Is really just an image of one of the workmen doing some work on the building after the work began. Trinity did about 22 years ago, undertook a master site plan and assessed, they have 3 buildings on the campus and they were all assessed, and the architects made recommendations about what kind of projects needed to be prioritized in terms of maintaining the building in not just functional shape, but good shape. So that was helpful. And then about 8 years ago, another architect came through, made additional recommendations based on that plan. And those recommendations said that regarding one wall in the church, Trinity had about 5 to 7 years before it really was structurally in critical shape. So about 7 years ago, they decided they needed to address that work. And then the question became, how were they going to fund it? Trinity is a small Episcopalian parish. I think there's probably about 80 people that are members in the parish at this point. So like many churches, the congregation is dwindling and aging at the same time. So they brought me on board to help them do the fundraising. I do development work as well, and really figure out how to get this project done. The first thing we did was do an update of the master site plan, which was an essential piece of the whole project, because that was our foundation for proposing any work that we did. It gave us all of it prioritized the projects, identified the needs, and even had associated cost with it. So it was very useful to Trinity for planning purposes, but it was also very useful to potential donors and supporters, because it gave them a high degree of confidence that we knew what we were doing, we had a plan, we could follow the plan. It gave them a sense of expectations on their part, and that was very useful for CPA funding as well as Mass Historic and major donors. So you can go to the next slide, if you will. This is just an overview. This is the west wall of the church, the work that had to be accomplished in this first go-round. And this was the scaffolding that was set up to take down that the piece of stone that fellow on the last slide was working on. Right behind this scaffolding, unfortunately, I don't have an image of it, but there is an absolutely beautiful round rose window that was designed especially for Trinity by Tiffany. So if you're ever in Lenox and want to see the church anyway, because architecturally it's stunning, but this window is beautiful. So feel free to stop by. This church is always open, so you can walk in and look around, but I'd be happy to show you around if you're in town. So anyway, that's just an image of what the work was like. And so we had the updated plan. And then the next slide is just another image of, I pulled this, I was so impressed. I thought masonry involved pouring a little water into sand and stirring it up and slapping it in there. I had no idea of the skill and the artistry really involved in that kind of work. And these guys were with a company that had worked on Trinity before, and they had master masonry people who had been involved in the field for like 20 years. So I was really impressed. So anyway, I just wanted to show that photograph to just give a sense of who was doing the work and how it was proceeding. So you can move on to the next slide. This is the beginning of the imaginative part. Because in thinking about how to accomplish this project, we started to think a little bit bigger and how we might really shape the whole project. And it really had to be undertaken in the context of a larger vision. What you're seeing here are the 3 buildings that comprise Trinity. The 2 red buildings, the largest is the church, the smaller is a parish hall, and the darkened roof one is the rectory and office. And it's at a very important geographical location in Trinity, because it's at the convergence of the 2 main routes coming into Trinity, and hence coming into Lenox and going to Tanglewood or Cropalo. So it's a real strategic location. So we envisioned here reconfiguring the campus and moving the driveway. You can see where it says ADA accessible ramp. the driveway is now going to go in there and add 5 parking spaces and open up that whole area between the 2 red buildings to be available for more public usage, as will the triangle be more available to the public. So this is part of Trinity beginning to reimagine its role really in the whole community. Trinity, most of the people that were parishioners thought of Trinity as a church and took for granted its role in the community as an important historical structure and architectural relic and icon, and also as part of the gateway to the community. And then as we consider things further, we realized that Trinity, we were thinking about adaptive reuse, and Trinity was already involved in adaptive reuse. They host concerts, they have a lecture series, they have community events. So it was already participating in a lot of things that it was taking for granted, sort of like a New Yorker who lives in New York, never goes to the Empire State Building. The Trinity people never really thought much about what value they really had in Trinity. So it was all about starting to kind of tease that out and get the internal audience excited about it so we could start talking about it publicly. So we did that, and we enlisted the support of town planning and the historic commission, talked to regional planners, talked to our state legislators and some local business people, and got people excited about the plan, and then applied for funding from CPA, and they gave us the first round of funding, and that was to be matching funds for MHC, and we were awarded those funds as well. Then we, so that work was continued, and we were awarded additional monies from Mass Historic. I guess they had some extra dollars left over, and they liked our project so well that they gave us about 20,000 more to complete some other work. Because, go to the next slide if you would, Beth. This is just an article that was in the paper, but the community outreach piece of this was very important. And about the time this article came out, one of the parishioners was at a luncheon with somebody, mentioned this project to this person, and this person wrote us a $50,000 check based on a conversation at a luncheon. That doesn't happen very often, but to me, it just really echoes the importance of how important community outreach and the support of the whole community is. Another thing we did that was very creative, part of the project was to get our bells ringing again. And we partnered with CBS Xerox, which is a copier company who is making sort of house calls, if you will, the local businesses. We printed up a postcard that was about the Trinity bells and the project, and that gave them something to hand to every business they walked into. So, and they contributed 2% of their revenues to the project, plus Trinity was in the face of every business in the county. So that was a pretty interesting partnering. Go to the next slide, if you will. This is just, again, sort of echoing adaptive use, reuse. Another article from the paper, but we have an annual concert honoring Martin Luther King Day at the church. So just the creative and the imaginative part was really broadening the stakeholder base to raise enough funds to get these projects done, and we're continuing to do that. And then if you go to the next slide, looking forward, what is noticeably missing from this, I realized this morning, is ongoing restoration. And as you all know, historic preservation doesn't happen just once. So there are ongoing projects that we have planned and that we've applied for funding for. And in the interim, we were surprised with about $150,000 worth of roof work that has to be done immediately. So that was kind of a surprise that we're needing to be flexible around. Technology and preservation is a whole topic in and of itself, but particularly because of COVID, it's raised lots of interesting questions about how to adapt the use and still preserve the sense of space with it. And the other two sort of speak for themselves, continuing to explore having different community groups and cultural organizations use the church, etc. So I'm so conscious of time. I don't know if I've talked too fast or, but Anyway, I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Eileen. That was really interesting. Thanks so much. Our last presentation, last but not least, is Frances Welson, and she is going to talk about the Yankee Peddler project in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And I love your title, Sometimes Everyone Wins. Frances, you're muted.
Okay, yeah,
Yep,
no, I
got it.
just fixed it. Okay.
Great, great.
I am a member of the Historical Commission in Holyoke. And yeah, this was an amazing, everything fell into place really well kind of story. This is a picture of the Yankee Peddler, a restaurant and event venue in Holyoke that was incredibly beloved by many, many Holyokers. In 1946, the Tambouris bought it and bought what was the home of Judge John Hildreth, who was once president and treasurer of the bank that became People's Bank in Holyoke. And they turned it into a restaurant. So it was one of the most special places to go for a birthday and anniversary, weddings. I can remember, I grew up in Holyoke, and I can remember going there, special birthdays or for dessert after a piano recital. It was just the special place to go out to eat, one of them in Holyoke. The Clayton family bought it from the Tambouris and ran it in 1995, and ran it in a number of different configurations, and finally just couldn't really make it work financially and put it up for sale. Nobody was interested in buying it and keeping it going as a restaurant and an event venue. So in 2018, so they closed it in 2016, having tried for quite a while to sell it. In 2018, People's Bank bought it. There was huge hue and cry in the city. People really wanted to see it saved, and there just didn't seem to be any way to do that. People's Bank, luckily, is very much a local community bank and very committed to the city. So they purchased the building and 2 acres of land, planning to put an office and a bank facility, teller lines and drive-through, all of that on the site. As a part of the property, you can show the next slide, please. As a part of the property, this is adjacent to the Peddler. The driveway goes between this house and the Peddler. This belonged to the Peddler. It was an historic, originally a home. It had been used a number of different ways. In order for the to meet codes, the bank had to get rid of this building to have enough parking spaces. It came before the Historical Commission because they wanted to take the house down. We were very, very torn. We didn't want to see this historic building demolished, but we also recognized how important the bank doing what they were going to do with the peddler itself was to the economy of the city and to historic preservation, in that they were committed to restoring the facade to look like the original, well, to fixing the facade to look like the original Hildreth house. Could you do the next slide, please? This is a picture, an early picture of the peddler with what the house, this is before a lot of renovations were made, when the peddler, this was when the peddler first opened, so it gives you an idea of what the original house looked like. When we did not impose a demolition delay, we said, please offer the house if someone will, offer it for $1 if someone will move it. Not really expect, well, hoping that maybe somebody would come along and want to move that house and restore it. We have in Holyoke a nonprofit organization now called One Holyoke that builds and renovates property for affordable housing. And they sell the homes with stipulations that people have to live there for a certain period of time and maintain it so that it really stays affordable housing. They went to the bank and said, we'll take it. The city had a vacant lot where there had been a fire many years ago, and there wasn't a use that had been proposed for that lot yet. So One Holyoke got that lot and moved the building. If you could do the next slide, please. Put it on a flatbed and moved it down one of the main, early Sunday morning, closed the streets. They took street lights down. It really was a major collaborative effort. The next slide is also a moving of the house. If you could show that, please. So the bank could meet codes with parking. They got some great PR from basically giving the house to One Holyoke. One Holyoke had a great opportunity and work on the house is underway as we speak, to restore that as affordable housing, a two-family affordable housing home in a neighborhood where that house historically and architecturally fits perfectly. The city will be getting tax revenue from the property that was sitting vacant. And I think, as I titled it, it was a win for everybody. If you could show the next slide, please. There is the house resettled, shortly after it was moved, resettled in its new spot. And there should be one more slide of the bank. Yes, and this is what People's Bank looks like sitting on Northampton Street in Holyoke. They kept many of the artifacts. They created in the first floor space a community room that community organizations can use for meetings or events. They auctioned some of the things from inside. So they didn't just demolish everything. They made them available to people who wanted to buy them, the ones that they didn't use. So it, as I said, it was a win-win-win all around. And one of the kind of thing that unfortunately we don't see enough as an historical commission. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share, and then we will, looks like we have a few questions. Chris, would you help to kind of moderate the questions?
Sure. So I guess the nice thing is here is that some of our speakers have already been responding to the questions. So I think some of them have already been answered. I see one at the bottom didn't get answered yet. So what was the cost of the restoration of the Northampton clock and the installation cost? Is Sarah still here? Let's see.
I don't know if she.
Right. Yeah, I don't see Sarah.
That's when we can follow up with her and maybe post that or email that out.
And she had her email on her slide, but she also
Yep.
put her email into the chat because it does sound like there's some other questions that with some other street clocks that there's interest in. So yeah, it definitely sounds like she's quite willing to talk some more about it with whoever's interested. All right. So yeah, if there's more questions, feel free to ask. And if we need to go off and just have more open-ended questions, not necessarily related to all these projects, that's fine too. We can have some other discussions here. So it looks like Walter's already done a great job of answering the questions that were related to Miller's Falls.
Apparently, we were all so successful that no one has any questions.
Is Walter still here too?
Yeah.
Oh, there he is.
I'm
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Sure.
Great. And so I haven't. We're just getting a project going in our office in the last couple of weeks regarding the building code. And so I always ask this question because I'm always curious for some case studies within what project that we're doing. So we've hired a consultant to do a project on the building code as it relates to historic buildings. So I get lots of questions related to the building code, and of course I can't answer any of those questions on the building code. I've always wanted some sort of resource for local commissions to be able to speak intelligently, just even as a layperson on a commission, to be able to speak with your building officials as a means to look at, are there some other options besides what you're often hearing. So I've wanted to have a guidebook that's just for local commissions and anyone interested in historic resources, all related to things with the building code. So I guess one of the things we're going to be doing in that guidebook is going to be looking at case studies. What are some really good case studies out there related to, well, in one case, whether it's the thresholds, the accessibility, all kinds of things that come up with historic properties that the building, it means a building may not get rehabilitated at all because there's a building code challenge there. And I'm always curious, are there some ways, some success stories out there where things like that have been overcome? You brought up an interesting point that where contractors have come in and said, no, we can't salvage this building. It needs to be torn down. And yet here the building stands today. So just wondering if you had any experiences with the building code in Montague.
Not specifically on the building code. I mean, those buildings were demoed because they had foundation problems. It wasn't like we were running up against accessibility issues. But our building commissioner is very flexible and was willing to work with the developer every step of the way. I can't get to I don't know the details of how they address the code issues, but everybody went into this with the attitude that we'd work out a solution, and then they figured out a way forward. We'd be happy to talk with you probably. Although, the closer you look, sometimes maybe they don't want to talk about it. I don't know. They figured out the way past some of the hard challenges there. But a guidebook like that would be an amazing resource to have for communities, because we're all trying to figure it out.
Great. Yeah, I've been looking forward to it for years, and we finally at a good point to getting it done. And actually, there's going to be a survey. So the consultant's going to be sending out a survey. It'll probably go through me actually to the local commission members. And we'll be looking for the kinds of things that you would like to see in this guidebook, and we'll be contacting all of you about potential case studies that you're aware of, either success stories, but also we're looking for case studies of where there's some impediment is there, where a building's just not viable because of a code issue right now. So we'll be looking for that in the next couple of weeks.
Mary has her hand up.
Okay. Mary Holtorf, I'm from the Athol Downtown Vitality Committee, and we're just in the early stages of doing a whole overlook of our downtown for restoration and zoning. And one of the things we've been talking about is taking a good look at our parking requirements for renovations and new construction, so that we don't turn our downtown into a parking lot for the requirements, to reduce or restructure the requirements, and also so that we can use shared parking from places like banks that are not open on weekends, but you might have a restaurant or a brew pub that has more business on the weekend. So that was just thinking about the church and how they worked with their parking, and the banks too, that the traditional modern parking requirements are often excessive for what you really need. So that was something to think about. So I'm very interested in the zoning guidebook, because hopefully we're going to be going through a lot of that in the near future.
So our guidebook will be more on things like building code, fire code, plumbing code, things like that. Not necessarily going on into zoning so much. Although there's some wonderful examples that I'm familiar with in terms of just parking issues. East Hampton is really interesting with their mill buildings, a huge mill complex in East Hampton. And they basically said to the developer of the mill building, we're not going to have parking requirements here. You can kind of figure it out on your own. And there's a market reason there, so that the the owner really wants to be able to figure out somehow that there's going to be adequate parking. So one of the ways that they were dealing with that was saying, okay, well, we're right next to a bike path, what was an active rail line right next to the mill building. Let's really push on the bicycle usage that would come as for transportation to the mill building. So that's one of the ways they dealt with trying to cut down on the surface parking for that mill building. Boston has done a really interesting thing I was reading about, where for a residential new construction, if you own a vehicle, you're not allowed to live there. So it's actually tracked through City Hall. They look through their records with registry and motor vehicles, and I guess excise registrations as well. And if they find that you own a vehicle, then you wouldn't be able to live in this building any longer. So it's a really interesting way of really saying everyone that lives here is either going to take public transportation, walk, or ride a bicycle. So you can get really creative if you wanted to.
And I'll say in Montague, we recently did some zoning updates, and we did away with parking minimums in the central business district. We still have them. If you have a residential unit, you still need a parking space per unit. But for any business or employee use, you don't need to provide off-street parking spaces. And we do allow for shared use parking as well through a special permit, which is not ideal, but at least there's a mechanism set up to allow businesses to share parking. So you're welcome to look at Montague's bylaws if you'd like an example.
Thank you.
Mary, which town were you from?
Athol.
Oh, Ethel. Okay.
Any other questions? Anyone? Any feedback on the format? In case our next meeting ends up being a Zoom also.
I thought it worked really well, Beth. I thought it went right along, and I could hear everyone, and it was very clear. It was good.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, and our attendance was good, so hopefully it didn't inhibit anybody from joining it, and maybe we had a few others who were able to, who normally wouldn't. I'm going to call on Barbara first. Barbara had her hand. Oh, I'm getting a thumbs up. Sorry, I was mixing that up with a hand up, and Ben gave me a thumbs up also, so that's great. I guess I'll just throw out there quickly because we're okay on time. Any suggestions for future topics? Just take a couple minutes if anyone has any suggestions. Mary has her hand up, so I will call on Mary.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Yeah, there's a lot coming down the pipeline in Athol. We have a church that was for sale for a couple of years and has recently been purchased by a local resident who has some plans for the use. And I think if we can help him financially redevelop the church, he's gonna need the help. It has a historic church pipe organ, big pipe organ in the church, and I know there's some issues with the structural integrity of the foundation. So I was really interested to hear about the clock that was restored and the church that was restored and what they went through with that. So I'm very glad you had this presentation and that I actually heard about it from our town planner and could attend. And I actually love Zoom meetings. It makes it a lot easier to attend, especially I heard you say at the beginning, you go from location to location. I'm all in favor of Zoom meetings, so.
Thank you. Claudia, her hand up.
Hi. I had a question. Our town is looking at proposing scenic road bylaws, and there's been a lot of discussion around stone wall preservation, and I'm just wondering for a future topic if there's any guidance. Have found some information on like terra firma, but not a whole lot about how to move forward with cataloging. Do you need landowner buy-in? Can the town do it on their own? Just wondering if that is at all an interest for anyone.
Okay, so just to be clear, stone wall restoration, is that what your topic that you're interested in?
Preservation and cataloging.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna jot that down. Thank you.
Beth, do you want me to talk a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm actually really interested in stone walls, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that, and whether that's on the phone or maybe a socially distanced visit to Ware at some point. That's certainly a possibility as well. I've often suggested for especially central Mass towns where we have so many stone walls, to really think about some sort of a planning project where you're really thinking about going out and identifying all the stone walls that you have in town. Whether that's including that on a structures form and an MHC form, on an MHC inventory form, or just coming up with some other way of identifying and documenting and describing conditions and heights and the type of stone wall that it is. Is it cut stone, or is it typical New England stone wall construction? And just getting a real sense of what you have in your community, and then thinking about, well, what are the challenges? So a lot of the challenges with stone walls are they're beautiful stones and they get stolen. So they get reused in landscaping projects. So they'll disappear through midnight landscaping and get reused somewhere else. So that's one of the ways that's one of the threats that they have nowadays with stone walls. Years ago, it sounds like one of the things that used to happen is that they get crushed up. If there was a road construction project, they'd get crushed up right there and put into the road construction project. I think that probably doesn't happen too much anymore. And I think especially if it's entirely on private property, the owner may just say, sure, you can have all the stones, and they'll be sold that way. So I think developing some strategies in terms of outreach and public appreciation and recognition that these are really not only a significant resource to the community, but also finite, even though it's such a ubiquitous sense of New England. When you think of New England, it's stone walls, but they are disappearing more, and so that they really think about some protection strategies. Scenic roads is one of those strategies. It's not a great strategy. I remember watching the news, Channel 5 News in Boston, back in like 1973, and hearing about the Scenic Roads Act that had just passed the state legislature at that time. So it's a useful thing to have a scenic roads bylaw and designating some of those roads as scenic roads, but it is pretty limited in what it's going to do for protecting stone walls, since it's really just about it's really all it's doing is requiring a hearing with the planning board when there's road construction that's taking place that would impact one of those walls. It's not going to do a lot of the things that are necessary. One of the things I've always wondered about is when stone walls are removed, if that's on the border where it's half owned by the town and half owned by the abutter, and so essentially on the property line, that means half of that stone wall is owned by the town. If that's the case, and if anyone ever removes any of those stone walls, that's theft from the town as far as I can tell. So that's one thing to make clear out there, I think, in terms of these are not only just these are not just some random stones along the road. These are actually town property, and theft of those stones could, if they're on town property, could be considered a crime, I would think. So I think all those things would get put into some sort of a scenic road, a stone wall protection plan, which I'd be happy to talk to you more. All right, 2 more things I just wanted to mention. In a couple of weeks, for our preservation conversations that we've been having with Preservation Mass, I don't know if any of you have been on those. We're going to have stone walls are going to be a topic in a couple of weeks is the plan. And the author is going to be Robert Thorson, who just wrote a book not recently, a while back, called Stone by Stone. I just read it. I don't devour books at all. My life is really busy and active, and I'm not a book devourer. But I read this book in 24 hours. It was a really interesting, fascinating history. Goes through the whole history of stone walls in New England. So if you want to learn about the history of stone walls, great resource there. He's going to be the guest speaker in a couple weeks on the preservation conversations. So look for that through Preservation Mass. All right, I'll stop.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we'll be planning another meeting and probably, I don't know, I think it's Berkshire's turn next. So in the next probably 3 or 4 months, we'll be planning something. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for hosting, Beth.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Beth.
Welcome.